Coming up on New Day at Arirang. South Korea is set to report over 500,000 new COVID-19 cases Thursday, surpassing the daily record yet again. The World Health Organization says the nation had the highest number of new infections in the world last week. Ukraine and Russia are reportedly getting closer to agreeing on a 15-point peace plan that would include a Russian troop withdrawal and ceasefire. The Financial Times says the deal was first discussed in full by officials from both countries on Monday. And the U.S. Federal Reserve approves a 0.25 percentage point rate hike, the first such rate hike in more than 3 years. It says it sees 6 more before the end of the year.
Hello and welcome to this Thursday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
And I'm Kim Mo-gan. It's 8 a.m. in Seoul, Korea on March 17th. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on issues facing Korea and the world.
We certainly will. We're going to start off with the Omicron surge in South Korea. Seemingly unabated surge at this point. The nation's set to see another record daily tally of new infections, and by quite the margin as well.
Experts say the surge seems to have entered its peak just a day before health authorities announced changes to social distancing guidelines. For more on this, we turn to our Han Sung-woo, who's joining us here in the studio. Good morning, Sung-woo.
Good morning.
So how are things looking today?
Mo-gan, let me say it's not looking good at all. More than 500,000 cases have already been recorded up until 9 p.m. Wednesday. South Korean health officials logged 549,854 new cases nationwide up until that time, and 108,000, that's 108,000 more compared to the same time on Tuesday. 1.8 times as many as the same time the previous Wednesday, and 3 times the number seen just 2 weeks ago. For clarification, let me add that yesterday's final tally was lower than the 9 p.m. numbers reported in the media the day before due to an error found in the counting process with the recent integration of positive results from rapid antigen tests into the official tally, leading to confusion. Several cases were reportedly left uncounted, and there's a chance they may have been included in today's preliminary numbers, which, if true, can partially explain the sharp hike. I want to direct our attention to a bigger problem, though. Authorities have been saying for days now that the ongoing Omicron surge would hit its peak sometime before the 22nd of March and reach a daily average of as high as 372,000. At this pace, though, that daily average may have to be recalculated.
Well, it seems certainly it will have to be recalculated if we're well on course for over 500,000 new cases today, considering the old estimate. But how does the domestic situation here in South Korea compare to other countries around the world? And where exactly does South Korea go from here in regards to trying to stem the spread of this virus?
Well, first of all, Mark, I'm sorry to say that over the 7-day period from March 7th to the 13th, Korea recorded the greatest amount of new COVID-19 infections in the world, with a whopping 2.1 million cases. That's according to the World Health Organization, which had Vietnam and Germany trailing behind Korea at second and third, both with around 1.5 million infections each. For reference, there was an 8% increase in the number of worldwide cases compared to the week before that period, but a 17% drop in the number of fatalities. Despite the domestic surge in cases, Korea's gradually pushing towards a return to normalcy, with Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum even suggesting the virus as an infectious disease should be reclassified from its current grade of level 1 to a lower grade. Likewise, health officials have been reassuring the public that everything's under control.
Assuming the peak of the surge lasts as predicted and we respond accordingly with the current system in place, we believe this wave will be the last significant threat in the nation's fight against the virus.
We'll have to wait and see, though, how recent numbers and the push towards normalcy will influence the government's decision to update its current social distancing scheme, which expires on Sunday. As I explained yesterday, several options are being discussed with stakeholders, including business owners and medical personnel, for the measures which come into effect on Monday, including maintaining the current guidelines, relaxing them further to allow private gatherings of 8 and restaurants to operate until midnight, or even lifting the rules altogether. But I'd have to say completely lifting them, despite public expectations, seems unlikely at this juncture.
Right, Sang-woo, thank you so much for your report. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Moving on to other news now. Russia's war against Ukraine is entering its 4th week and the death toll on both sides is mounting up. However, there could potentially be some hope on the horizon.
Senior officials from both sides say the two countries have made progress in drawing up a 15-point plan to end the war, but admit negotiations remain extremely complex. The plan on the table right now includes Ukraine renouncing its ambitions to join NATO, a ceasefire, and Russian military withdrawal. Victor Flood has more.
Russia and Ukraine have reportedly made significant progress on reaching a tentative peace deal. According to numerous media outlets, including the Financial Times and Sputnik, negotiators from the two countries have discussed the proposed deal in full for the first time. The 15-point draft includes a ceasefire and Russian withdrawal, with Kyiv having to accept neutrality and curbs on its armed forces. In addition, Ukraine has to give up its bid to join NATO. Despite projected optimism over efforts to end the war, Ukrainian officials accuse Russian forces of shelling a convoy of cars carrying fleeing civilians. They explained the city of Mariupol has been enduring a humanitarian catastrophe for days now, including an airstrike on a theatre where hundreds of displaced people were believed to have been sheltering. The UN says over 700 civilians have been killed since Russia launched its invasion on February 24th. Saying this includes over 50 children, the UN added the actual figures might be even higher. Against this backdrop, President Biden on Wednesday vowed additional US security assistance to Ukraine.
Now I'm once again using my presidential authority to activate an additional security assistance to continue to help Ukraine fend off Russia's assault. An additional $800 million in assistance.
Biden explained that the US will help Ukraine acquire additional long-range missile anti-aircraft systems at the request of Ukraine's president. He added Washington will also supply 9,000 anti-armor systems, drones, as well as 7,000 small arms, including machine guns, to help Ukraine's civilians defend their country. The International Court of Justice has also ordered that Moscow immediately halt its invasion, saying it's, quote, profoundly concerned by Russia's actions in Ukraine. While the court's rulings are binding, the ICJ has no direct means of enforcing them, and countries have ignored them in the past. President Putin has again reiterated that Russia's goal in Ukraine is to achieve a neutral status for the country. This, he says, refers to Ukraine's demilitarization and denazification. Victor Flood, Arirang News.
The World Health Organization says its evaluation of Russia's Sputnik V COVID-19 vaccine has been postponed for the time being due to what it calls an uneven situation. Speaking at a press briefing Wednesday, the health agency's vaccines expert said a WHO team was originally scheduled to visit Russia on March 7th to assess the facilities where these shots are produced. She explained finding flights has been difficult due to sanctions and the war in Ukraine.
Now, in a bid to contain the most intense inflation the US has seen since the 1970s, the Federal Reserve has decided to raise its target for short-term interest rates by 25 basis points. This is the first time the Fed has hiked rates in 3 years. Yoon Suk-yeol with this report.
For the first time since 2018, the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 1/4 percentage point. The policy-setting Federal Open Market Committee on Wednesday decided to increase the federal funds rate to a range of 0.25% to 0.5%. For consumers and businesses, this increase in short-term interest rates will mean higher rates for loans. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell explained that the measure is to restore price stability amid sky-high inflation that has been running at the highest levels in 4 decades. Powell expressed some optimism, forecasting that the hike in interest rates would be a stepping stone for stable growth.
Although the invasion of Ukraine and related events represent a downside risk to the outlook for economic activity, FOMC participants continue to foresee solid growth. As shown in our summary of economic projections, the median projection for real GDP growth stands at 2.8% this year, 2.2% next year, and 2% in 2024.
But the GDP growth projected for this year is lower than what had been forecast in December. Back then, Fed policymakers had expected the economy to grow by 4% at a time when the biggest economic threat was thought to be the pandemic. But now the Fed has detected new risks facing the global economy, mainly the invasion of Ukraine and spiking commodity prices. The Fed also believes inflation will stay above its annual 2% target, even with 6 more interest rate adjustments expected between now and the end of this year. The central bank's policymakers expect inflation to remain elevated at 4.1% until the end of 2022. 신예은, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. It was one of the most highly anticipated meetings of the year. The Federal Open Market Committee met for 2 days this week to determine how aggressively the Federal Reserve will pursue interest rate hikes in light of the soaring inflation in the US as well as Russia's war against Ukraine. The Fed had the unenviable task of trying to guide American monetary policy through a period of turbulence not seen in many a decade. Prior to the meeting, experts said the war and its impact on global inflation may have complicated the Fed's plans, but they forecast it wouldn't be enough for the Fed to deviate significantly anyway from its stated path of tightening monetary policy.
In the end, the Fed announced a 0.25% interest rate hike on Wednesday, the first increase since 2018. Prices in the U.S. have increased 7.9% over the past year, the fastest rate of inflation since 1982. Last month, prices were up 0.8%, an acceleration from January. For more, we connect to Professor Song Soo-young of Chungang University in Seoul. Good morning, Professor.
Yeah, good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Now, first, I would ask, did anything surprise you about the Fed's decision?
Not at all, because it is already predicted, but less than the expectation of some market practitioners and some academics, because some people have argued that the 0.5 percentage point increase or so more short-term interest rate hike is expected, but it is exactly what the moderate economists and academicians has expected. So this is right on the path.
Okay, and do you think that the Fed's move really does enough to limit the impact on the US economy and financial markets of the ongoing geopolitical tensions surrounding Ukraine, as well as soaring inflation? Do you think they took the easy route, or do you think they took the right route?
Yeah, because of the Russia and Ukraine war, actually the pressure on the hike of interest rate has been relieved for the Fed perspective, because there is a huge pressure to increase the interest rate, the short-term interest much higher. But because of the war, and then most of the world, and particularly in US, they are concerned about the upcoming imminent recession because of the war, in addition to some supply disruption originated from some conflict of trade between US and China. Therefore, actually, this is easier for the Fed to determine some 0.52 percentage point increase of the federal funds rate, and expected to be 6 more times by the end of the 2022. So this is I think most appropriate and very considerate decision over the interest rate, and because it is quite a balanced approach to because both we have to find some optimal or trade-off relationship between the recession and then control of the inflation.
Now, Professor, the Fed also discussed when it will start paring the bond holdings on its roughly $9 trillion balance sheet, but still a lot remains up in the air. So when do you think we will have a clear picture of the Fed's roadmap to start reducing its holdings?
I think because if the Fed decided to sell all those purchased bonds to the market, that could lift a very high pressure on the price, therefore, which could increase some yield. So that means that in the long-term interest rate has been pressured to be increased also. So that is not good for the Fed. Because of that could change the people's inflation expectation in terms of the long-term interest rate. Therefore, I don't think it will be imminent to sell off those purchased bonds in the market to the market at all. So, but anyway, they stopped purchasing, and then they tried to normalize their balance sheet or Fed balance sheet, but quite moderately and a little bit slowly. That's what I expect right now.
Yeah, some analysts are saying we might have a clearer picture sometime in the summer. But finally, I just wanted to get your opinion, because the Fed and the Biden administration outwardly are saying, look, we're slightly concerned about inflation, but do you think they are more concerned than they're letting on? Initially, people like Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell were saying this period of inflation was nothing more than a transitory phase, but now they're finally admitting that it's here to stay and could potentially get worse in the months to come. In your opinion, just how bad do you think inflation could become in the US over the course of this year?
Considering the market situation and the data, I'm still on the side of the transitory, but transitory effect of inflation is a little bit longer than expected. That is surely true. But considering the oil price change and some possibility of the recession, then as you see in the market, the future price of the Western Texas Intermediate and the Brent has been declined, sharply. So that means that in the market, we are very concerned about the upcoming recession. Therefore, that's why the U.S. Federal Reserve decided to decide on the middle of the point of interest rate hike. So the Biden administration, they have tried to encourage the economy and grow the economy in the right path because they have to pass the legislation of the Build Back Better plan through the Congress. So the current situation is a little bit in the middle of the uncertainty, but still it is the most appropriate way to overcome the upcoming inflation. And I still believe that the inflation is transitory. Once the supply chain is resolved, then the inflation problem is not anymore a serious threat against the world economy and the U.S. economy.
Right. Professor, thank you so much for your insights. This was Professor Song Soo-young of Chungang University. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. South Korea's President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison spoke over the phone for about half an hour on Wednesday, discussing ways to deepen bilateral ties and overcome challenges to peace and stability. Officials for the president-elect say they also agreed to increase cooperation on achieving carbon neutrality and to make advances in space and other high-tech areas. Just last year, the two countries' relationship was upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership to celebrate 60 years of diplomatic ties. Yoon and Morrison also spoke about the war in Ukraine and related international concerns. The call came after a lunch meeting planned between President Moon Jae-in and the president-elect was cancelled earlier in the day.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's transition committee is taking shape. More appointments announced, including 2 policy advisors who were part of former Park Geun-hye administration. Others were former colleagues of Yoon from his time as a prosecutor. Kim Do-yeon with the details.
South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol named more close aides on Wednesday as he begins to form his own administration. 2 of them worked with former President Park Geun-hye. First, Kang Seok-kun, a professor at Seongshin Women's University, joins as a special advisor for policy. In the past, he served as a parliament member and was an aide during President Park's administration. Kim Hyun-suk, a professor at Seongshin University, joins Yoon as well, having worked closely with the president-elect throughout the election campaign. She has also been a member of parliament in the past and was an aide to former President Park. In addition, for the role of Special Advisor for Government Affairs, Yoon named Chang Sung-min, a party member that competed with Yoon for the party's presidential candidacy nomination. He had been a vocal critic of Yoon, but the president-elect's spokesperson says Yoon received important advice from Chang throughout the election. The president-elect also has called up 2 of his close colleagues from the prosecution to help him in the transition committee. Ko Jin-won, current head for the investigations for fair trade in Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office, as well as Lee Dong-gyun, a chief prosecutor at Seoul Southern District Prosecutor's Office, are set to join the committee. The Justice Ministry declined to confirm the English spellings of the 2 prosecutors' names, citing violation of the Personal Info Protection Act. The 2 have close ties with the president-elect from the past as they helped Yoon pass the nomination hearing on his path to become the prosecutor general. As for the transition committee's signboard hanging ceremony here at the Tongidong office, the head of the committee, An Chul-soo, says it may happen as early as this weekend. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The spokesperson for South Korea's president-elect has reiterated that the presidential office will move from its current location under the Yoon administration. Officials say a defense ministry building in Seoul's Yongsan district is a viable candidate. Kim Yeon-seung reports.
A historic move may be on its way. President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol is determined to uproot the presidential office from the Blue House, located behind Gyeongbokgung Palace. But the question is, where will it go?
The possibility of President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol going into the original Blue House is basically zero. The current Blue House feels like a lot like a royal palace, and it had often cut off communication with the public.
Yoon wishes to move right to the beating heart of the city. The Foreign Ministry building in Gwanghwamun and the Defense Ministry building in Yongsan have risen as the top contenders for the new presidential office. But these buildings come with their own challenges. First of all, the Foreign Ministry building is dogged with security problems. With a lot of high skyscrapers right next door, guarding the new president may be extra difficult. Also, this building has no space for a heliport, underground bunkers, or reception halls. So as a viable alternative, the Defense Ministry building in Yongsan is being discussed. This area doesn't have any other high structures surrounding the building. It also has plenty of space and has an underground bunker already built in. The place also holds true to Yoon's intention to stay amid the public. If he steps out, he's right in the geographic center of the city. But this location comes with its own challenges.
Some people may find the Defense Ministry hard to approach. Also, if the intention was to communicate with people at a closer location, the building in Yongsan is more secluded than the one in Gwanghwamun.
Moving the presidential office won't be a simple issue. There needs to be a discussion about how apt it is to move to Yongsan because the development of surrounding areas and land regulations will follow.
Some are also concerned that if the presidential office moves to Yongsan, Gwanghwamun and its surrounding area will lose its symbol as South Korea's political hub. For centuries, the leaders of South Korea, kings and presidents alike, have settled into the Gwanghwamun area. But with Yoon coming into office, that Gwanghwamun era may come to an end. Kim Yong-sun, Arirang News.
Now it's time for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs. It's been around 3 weeks since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, and Russian forces are continuing to pound cities across Ukraine. Powerful explosions have been reported in almost all of Ukraine's main urban areas, including in the capital. The number of deaths, both military and civilian, are soaring, and millions of ordinary Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries to seek safe haven, creating a refugee crisis in numerous Eastern European countries. Peace talks between the two sides are taking place, and there appears to be some slow progress being made. But when will this war finally end, and what of the diplomatic and economic ramifications for South Korea and other countries? For a closer look at this, I'm pleased to say we are joined by Professor Kim Won-soo, Rector of the Global Academy for Future Civilizations at Kyung-hee University in Seoul, and Christopher A. Hartwell, Professor of the School of Management and Law at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. Professor Kim and Professor Hartwell, thank you ever so much for joining us to talk about Russia and Ukraine. Professor Kim, thank you. Professor Kim, let's start with you. So the general sentiment is that President Putin was expecting a quick victory, but the war is still raging on, of course, and it's arguably becoming even more entrenched. Peace negotiations, as we were reported on just before, are and have been taking place, but there hasn't really been any significant breakthrough to speak of, anything official anyway. However, Ukraine's president says Russia's demands are becoming more realistic, and also Russia's foreign minister has weighed in, saying that he thinks there's some hope for reaching a compromise. However, both sides also stressing that talks are really difficult. What's your opinion? Do you think Russia is keen to end this as soon as possible, considering that Putin likely didn't expect this much resistance from Ukraine?
You are absolutely right. The original war plan of President Putin is quick, short war. But things on the ground didn't turn out the way as he wishes, mainly due to the much stiffer, much stronger resistance by Ukraine. So now the question for President Putin is how to achieve his purpose without losing his face. So it is not surprising to see negotiations going on much slowly than the rest of the world wants to see. But as Ukraine President and Foreign Minister suggested, there are certain signs of progress going forward. But we have to assume that given the wide differences of positions on several fundamental issues, including the neutrality of Ukraine, the status of Donbas region, and what to do about Crimea region, and these questions are very difficult for both sides to bridge the differences, but keep talking for a negotiated settlement itself is a positive sign, because there is no way to end the war without talking to each other for a negotiated settlement. But we have to assume it will take time.
Yeah, considering how one side has very strong feelings about what they want and the other side has very strong feelings about what they want, it seems that it is going to be a slow process, unfortunately, for the people of Ukraine. Professor Hartwell, turning to you now. So we're seeing this refugee crisis unfold, and many aid organizations are saying it's probably one of the worst they've seen anywhere in modern times, especially in the Western world, in Europe. Families torn apart, of course, thousands of people losing their lives, both military and civilian. A number of journalists have been also killed there. Just how serious do you think the situation is on the ground, both in terms of the war as well as the refugee crisis?
Well, we'll start with the refugee crisis. I think what we've seen, kind of echoing what was just said, is that this war is going not the way the Russians had anticipated. I think what we've only seen that the Russian military is good at is shooting at people that don't shoot back, whether they're shooting at hospitals, whether they're shooting at high-rise blocks, whether they're shooting at theaters. So they're creating a humanitarian disaster, especially in the south and the east. Mariupol today, the reports of the theater, the drama theater, where 1,000 people were hiding out, that was clearly marked that children were there, hit in a kind of a blatant act of terrorism. So the refugee crisis is bad, especially in places on the ground where the Russians are still shelling, and it's going to get worse. In terms of the war, on the other hand, if we're thinking from the Ukrainian side, there's a lot to kind of be heartened about, in that we're 3 weeks in. The Russians have not captured anything except for Kherson, which is right at the tip of the Crimean Peninsula. They've actually been pushed back in a few areas. They haven't been able to break out of Donbass. So the war is going well from the Ukrainian side, but I feel that the Russians are trying to ratchet up the pain for the Ukrainians. How long do the Ukrainians want to see their children murdered? And will they then come to the negotiating table?
And staying with you, Professor Hartwell, we just heard that the EU has agreed on a 4th round of sanctions against Russia. These target things like steel, iron, export ban on luxury goods and on investment in the energy sector. So there is a mind-boggling amount of sanctions on Russia right now. However, critics say that Moscow is able to skirt them in various different ways. In your mind, are the sanctions in place now having the desired effect? And just walk us through, if you believe that Russia can get around them, how they're able to do that.
Well, the sanctions have been also a surprise, I believe, to Putin's regime. They didn't expect that the West was going to have this kind of resolve to do things so quickly, to disconnect banks from the SWIFT system. Not all Russian banks, but some banks, to go beyond kind of their normal response of, well, we'll sanction Putin and Lavrov and a few other people, to kind of keep widening it, to seize oligarchs' yachts, and now to forcibly deglobalize the country. I mean, the masterstroke here was freezing the foreign reserves of the Central Bank of Russia, which is definitely uncharted territory. So the sanctions have gone a lot further, and they've gone faster than anyone has ever seen. That being said, there's still room to kind of move them forward. In general, sanctions usually take a long time to bite, and during that time, you get better at skirting them, like you said. Russia did a very good job after the first round of very, very bland sanctions in 2014 imposed by President Obama, which he didn't want to do. They did a very, very good job of kind of moving towards import substitution. But the Russians underestimated how much they were still plugged into global value chains. So it's going to be very, very difficult to skirt the IT sector, the agricultural sector, ones that are still dependent on foreign technology. It might come from India, it might come from China, but it's not going to be the panacea that solves all their ills.
Right, I want to touch upon China a bit later on in the conversation, but turning back to you, Professor Kim. So the IMF talking about how this is affecting people around the world now. The IMF saying that this is having a real damaging impact, as you would imagine, on the global economy, eroding growth, hurting supply chains and pumping up already sky-high inflation. Can you explain in economic terms how this crisis is affecting people like us here in South Korea, for example, thousands of kilometers away, how on a base level it's affecting our own lives?
As you said, the Russian invasion of Ukraine as salt to the wounds in the global economy, as you said, by pushing inflationary pressure, because Russia and Ukraine are main players in global food and fuel supply. So what is going on now will definitely create upward pressure on oil prices, and also it will cause a very serious food crisis to the countries in the developing world, because Ukraine is a main food exporter to the countries in the developing world. So this will create problems for those population of the world, particularly at serious risk. And now by adding Ukrainian refugees and internally displaced persons on top of the refugee crisis we already have, this will create much more burdensome problems on the humanitarian agencies around the world, because already we have over 85 million refugees under protection by international agencies, and now we have 3 million refugees and over 10 million internally displaced persons in Ukraine. This will create a much more severe and additional pressure and burden on the international humanitarian relief system.
Okay, and staying with you, Professor Kim, and then Professor Hartwell, just afterwards, if I could get your opinion briefly as well. Because, to be honest, many critics of the Biden administration are saying, what's taking US President Biden so long to go over to Europe? But he's finally going over there next week. He's been sending people like Kamala Harris. People haven't been overly impressed with what she's been saying over there, and Jake Sullivan, but lower level officials. But he's heading to the NATO summit on March 24th to discuss Russia. Do you expect any tangible results to come out of that NATO summit? Professor Kim, starting with you.
Yes, I think it's a very timely visit. I think for two reasons. Because through his visit, he can highlight U.S. commitment to give assistance to Ukrainian people. And secondly, also, he can use that visit as an opportunity to reassure NATO partners of U.S. security commitments to defend them. And as Professor Hartwell said, the sanctions this time on Russia are much tougher and more comprehensive. And also, President Biden can use his visit as a way to strengthen sanctions, and also how to upscale humanitarian and other supports to be provided by European partners in cooperation with the U.S. to Ukrainian people and government.
And quickly to you, as a follow-on to that, Professor Hartwell, before we move on to our next question, just want to ask you, because we're in the fourth week of this war now, but we're only just hearing that President Biden's going to go over to Europe. Do you think he's kind of dropped the ball by acting so late to become kind of like the statesman that you would expect the US president to be in a situation like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where I kind of disagree with Professor Park. I don't think Biden going to the NATO summit is for Eastern Europe. I think it's for Western Europe. It's, you know, kind of assuaging allies in Western Europe that the United States is disengaging from NATO, as, you know, kind of Trump might have threatened a few years ago. I think there's something just in kind of Biden's DNA, because it was part of Obama's he was vice president under Obama, and Obama was famously leading from behind. That's what the United States is doing here. There's been some, you know, great progress in terms of the sanctions. But, I mean, if you look at the prime ministers of Poland, of Czechia, and of Slovenia that went to Kiev, you know, it's taken Biden 3 weeks to go to Europe. Meanwhile, you've had these frontline states that actually went into a war zone to show their support. That I think they're still leading from behind, and they should be leading from the front.
Yeah, it was really incredible to see those three prime ministers actually going right into the thick of it, going into Kiev like that. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I have to ask you this, Professor Hartwell. So the US earlier this week warned that China will absolutely face consequences if it helps Russia evade sanctions. This after a report surfaced that said that Moscow asked Beijing for military equipment and financial support. Two sub-questions, really. Don't you actually think this is already happening behind the scenes? And what would these, quote, consequences from Washington actually look like for Beijing?
Well, I'm not a China expert. I've lived in Russia and worked in Ukraine. I can only say that I think as the war continues to go on, it becomes less and less in China's interest to tie itself to a losing junior partner like Russia. And in any China-Russian rapprochement, it's always been that Russia was going to be the junior partner to China. I don't think that there is going to be any way that if this continues to drag on and Russia continues to show the kind of abysmal performance on the ground that it has, the Chinese are going to throw good money after bad. I don't know what the serious consequences could be for China. I think this was more just a shot across their bow to tell them that you don't want to hitch your wagon to a losing horse like Putin.
Well, you can already kind of see the Chinese Communist Party backpedal a little bit in their support for Russia in this war against Ukraine. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this discussion at this point. But Professor Kim and Professor Hartwell, we greatly appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The South Korean military says North Korea on Wednesday tried to test launch what appeared to have been its new ICBM, the Hwasong-17. However, it appears it failed, exploding just after launch. The U.S. condemned the attempted launch, calling it a destabilizing move. Park Geun-hye reports.
South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the North launched an unidentified projectile at around 9:30 on Wednesday morning, but said it failed soon after liftoff. It said it appeared to be a ballistic missile and was fired from the district of Sunan in the regime's capital, Pyongyang.
It appears that the suspected ballistic missile fired this morning by North Korea from Sunan area in Pyongyang has failed after it was launched. South Korea and U.S. intelligence agencies are currently conducting detailed analysis on the matter.
The military reportedly said the suspected missile exploded at some point below an altitude of 20 kilometers. It also reportedly said Wednesday's launch was a test of the regime's new ICBM, called Hwasong-17, which was first unveiled at a military parade in October 2020. Although specific details are yet to be disclosed, it's likely that the launch was indeed a test of its ICBM. This is because an airfield in Sunan is where ballistic missiles were launched recently, on March 5th and on February 27th. The regime claimed those were tests for the development of a reconnaissance satellite, but they were widely seen as thinly disguised tests for the Hwasong-17. Following Wednesday's failed launch, the U.S. military's Indo-Pacific Command said the projectile was in fact a ballistic missile and condemned the move. It urged Pyongyang to refrain from further destabilizing acts. North Korea has not conducted any ICBM tests or nuclear tests since November 2017, when it launched the Hwasong-15. But it not only appears to be developing a new ICBM, it was also seen last week restoring some demolished tunnels at its nuclear test site. Park Geun-hye, Arirang News.
A powerful 7.3 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Fukushima on Wednesday night, jolting eastern Japan. The quake was even felt as far away as Tokyo. Shortly after the quake hit, an advisory for tsunami waves up to 1 meter was issued for parts of Japan's northeastern coast. Authorities are warning residents in Fukushima, Miyagi, and Yamagata prefectures to expect aftershocks. The earthquake struck a matter of days after Fukushima marked the 11th anniversary of the earthquake, tsunami, and subsequent nuclear disaster that devastated the region in March 2011.
Now we're going to take a look at news from around the world. For that, we turn to our Easing Jae joining us live from Arirang's newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
So, Seung-jae, the UK repaid a massive debt to Iran on Wednesday, and some are wondering if that's why 2 British Iranians were released after years of detention.
That's right. So just kind of going back into the story in itself, I mean, Iran's foreign minister on Wednesday did confirm that the UK had repaid a historic debt of $530 million, a massive sum that was said to have been received by Iran a few days ago. Now, the UK's debt to Iran goes back to when the UK failed to deliver a consignment of Chieftain tanks, which were ordered by the Shah of Iran before he was overthrown in the 1979 following the Iranian Revolution. Now, in 2009, the UK did admit that it owed Iran for the undelivered tanks, but claimed that the debt could not be honored while Iran was still subject to economic sanctions for its nuclear program. Now, following news that the debt had been repaid, 2 British Iranians held captive in Iran for years were released. However, Iran's foreign minister denied there were any links between the release of the prisoners and the debt being repaid. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Wednesday met with UAE's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed as part of efforts to secure additional oil and increase pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin over Ukraine. Now, according to Johnson's office, the British Prime Minister stressed the need to work together to stabilize the global energy market. Now, following that meeting, Johnson also met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, but failed to secure commitments from Saudi Arabia to step up oil production. Johnson said he had an understanding from his meeting with these Saudis that instability in the world markets from a spike in energy prices caused by the Ukraine crisis was not in their interests. Now, another journalist has been shot dead in western Mexico, marking the 8th to be killed in the country in 2022, raising fears about the safety of journalists there. Armando Linares, the director of Monitor Michoacan, was shot dead just 6 weeks after a colleague from the same organization was killed. Before his death, Linares told other media outlets that armed groups who passed themselves off as cartel members might be behind the killings. The Michoacan state has long been marred by turf wars between powerful gangs battling for control of the drug market. And finally, the UN says it's received only $1.3 billion in pledges on Wednesday towards a $4.27 billion aid plan this year for war-torn Yemen. More than 17 million people in Yemen currently need food assistance, and the UN predicts that the figure could rise to 19 million in the second half of the year. The lack of pledges comes despite an urgent appeal from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for donors to contribute generously. Now, the biggest contributor was the United States, who pledged $585 million.
Good morning. Today's conditions will see murky skies with rainfall. It's much needed and welcomed rain for inland regions, but Jeju and mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province might not be happy with the amounts and snow they have to deal with. Well, right now, east of Gangwon-do and southern provinces are seeing rainfall, which will slowly spread it to the capital by tonight. Jeju will see 30 to 80 millimeters of heavy rain into tomorrow, while mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province will see heavy snowfall with a heavy snow advisory being in place. Well, thick clouds kept temperatures on the warmer side overnight, so it's a mild start to the day, but rain-affected regions could have morning lows that are higher than afternoon highs. Well, that's including over in Daegu, starting out the day at 11 degrees Celsius, but we'll see an afternoon high of just 10 degrees, which is also about 13 degrees lower than yesterday. But the capital region will have similar ranges to yesterday. Well, another round of rain is in the forecast on Saturday, along with big drop in temperatures in the forecast. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Have a wonderful day. New day at Arirang. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Friday, the last day of the working week. Until next time, goodbye.
Everyone knows I'm passionate. Know why? Look at how passionate Koreans are. And you know I'm fast. Don't blink. Koreans move fast too. I'm creative on the pitch. People say I'm smart. Just look how smart Korea is. I aim to be spectacular.